Imagine stepping into the private chambers of the most powerful man in England, gilded tapestries, roaring hearths, and the scent of rot. Behind the throne, the legend, and the 6 ill-fated wives was a king whose personal habits were as foul as they were fascinating. King Henry VIII may have ruled a kingdom, but he couldn't rule his own body. Today, we pull back the velvet curtain and reveal the top 5 most disgusting hygiene practices of King Henry VIII, a monarch draped in luxury but steeped in filth. 1. The boil that never healed. It started with thunder, the roar of horses, the clash of armor, and a king too proud to fall. But in January 1536, King Henry VIII did fall. During a jousting tournament, his horse collapsed on top of him, and the resulting injury to his leg would haunt him for the rest of his life. What appeared at first to be a simple blow, painful, yes, but survivable, soon developed into something far more sinister. Beneath the swollen flesh, infection took hold. A lesion formed and refused to close. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and then the wound began to rot. It would never fully heal. What the court whispered about, and what history almost tried to ignore, was that the King of England, the man who once danced, hunted, and rode with unrivaled vigor, had become a prisoner inside a body that was decaying while still alive. The leg ulcer oozed, it bled, it wept a constant stream of yellow pus and blackened clots. The stench was unmistakable. Courtiers described it as sour and metallic, thick enough to cling to the tapestries. Wherever Henry went, it followed. A smell of rotting meat wrapped in perfume. Attendants tried to mask it with crushed herbs. Lavender, thyme, and sage stuffed into pouches and tucked under the king's robes. They burned incense in his private chambers. Scented rushes were scattered across the floors, but it wasn't enough. The wound was deeper than flesh. It became a symbol, a hidden truth behind the throne. The king, for all his jewels and divine authority, was rotting from the inside out. Each day began with pain. Physicians would arrive with iron instruments, long, thin probes meant to pierce the abscess and release the poison within. They pressed into the leg, searching for pockets of pus to drain. Cloth soaked in wine or vinegar was packed into the wound to cleanse it, though it often only worsened the inflammation. Sometimes they used honey, believed to draw out infection. But more often than not, it was agony with no reward. The leg would swell again the next morning. The bandages were soaked through with pus and blood. And still, the king endured it, refusing to show weakness. He barked orders and held court even as attendants crouched beside him, blotting filth from a wound that never stopped screaming. No royal decree could silence a smell. Even ambassadors from foreign courts noted it in their letters. They described shortened meetings, sudden departures, and a stifling odor that seemed to rise from the king himself, and yet none dared say a word to his face. To suggest that the king was unwell, to even imply that his body was failing, was political suicide. Henry was the head of the church, the embodiment of power, so they bowed deeper, spoke more softly, and praised his strength. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, physicians argued over how to treat him. Surgeons muttered warnings, and the court learned to live with the stink of denial. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was no longer the golden prince of Europe. He was bloated, bitter, and barely able to walk. His leg, wrapped in layers of cloth and soaked through with ointments, had become a grotesque symbol of everything the court tried to hide. And yet he still wore ermine. He still sat upon the throne. He smiled with blackened teeth. He roared with laughter, because kings do not bleed, they do not suffer, they do not rot, not publicly, but behind every royal decree, every executed wife, every flash of fury was the constant ache of a festering wound. It never healed, it never would, and it followed him to the grave. But while his leg oozed in silence, the rest of his body told a story just as foul, one soaked not in water, but in superstition. 2. The bathing ban. To a modern mind, refusing a bath sounds eccentric at best, filthy at worst. But in the 16th century, water wasn't a path to health, it was a pathway to death. Tudor physicians taught that hot water opened the pores and allowed bad humours and invisible vapours to seep into the body. Illness, they claimed, was airborne, carried on the breeze, lurking in steam, and waiting to invade softened flesh. And so, King Henry VIII, who ruled with a sword in one hand and divine right in the other, avoided the bath not out of laziness, but out of calculated fear. To soak was to weaken. To expose the skin was to invite death, and Henry was a man who could never afford to appear vulnerable, not even to himself. Instead of washing, Henry indulged in ritual. He believed in the purifying power of linen, soft white undergarments that hugged the skin and in his mind absorbed its poisons. He would change his linen multiple times a day, sometimes up to 5 times, especially when plagued by fevers or swelling. The act was not just hygienic, it was symbolic. Fresh cloth meant renewed strength. Servants were tasked with folding, warming, and presenting the linens like holy offerings. His inner garments became a kind of second skin, a barrier between the world and his flesh, and he treated them with reverence. To touch the king's linen was to be trusted. To see him without it, unthinkable. What Henry lacked in water, he made up for in scent. Each morning, his body was wiped down with cloths soaked in rosewater, herbal infusions, or vinegar blends created by his apothecaries. These mixtures were meant to freshen the skin, repel disease, and preserve his image of strength. Servants dabbed under his arms, along his chest, between his thighs. Everywhere the body betrayed its humanity. These were not brief gestures, but long, practiced ceremonies. They scrubbed without soap. They powdered after drying, and they avoided the wound on his leg, which was cleaned separately with grim precision. Henry's body became an altar to control, a temple never truly cleansed but always carefully disguised. On the rare occasions Henry did agree to a full bath, it was more spectacle than sanitation. His wooden tub, lined with linen, padded with cushions, and surrounded by scented herbs, was not filled with a tap, but by dozens of servants hauling boiling water by bucket. It took hours to prepare. At least 3 attendants stood by to hold towels, pour oils, and guard the door. Bathing was a royal operation, performed maybe a few times a year, and only when the stars, or the doctors, demanded it. Even then, Henry rarely submerged himself fully. He soaked only briefly, dried quickly, and was immediately dressed in fresh linens, as if afraid the water might remember him. To bathe frequently was in Henry's mind to flirt with weakness. Water softened, it exposed the body, it revealed scars, sores, and vulnerability. Henry could not be soft. He could not be seen as mortal. Instead, he built his image layer by layer, linen, oils, silks, fur. He was not a man. He was a fortress. To wash away those layers was to risk washing away the myth. So he didn't, and thus behind the royal seals, beneath the jeweled rings and under the heavy crown, was a man who ruled with iron and sweat. Never scrubbed, never soaked, never seen naked by the world. Because kings in his eyes didn't need to bathe. They just needed to reign. 3. Toothpaste made of sugar and charcoal. Henry VIII had an appetite worthy of legend. Tables buckled under the weight of roasted boars, pies stuffed with dates and almonds, candied fruits and oceans of mead and wine. But what truly seduced the king was sugar. White, glistening, and absurdly rare in Tudor England. Imported from distant colonies and locked away in gilded boxes, sugar was more valuable than gold, and Henry devoured it like a man consuming the empire itself. Sweets were not just food, they were power, luxury, and excess. He didn't just enjoy sugar, he flaunted it. His teeth, however, had no such ambition. One might assume a king of Henry's stature would employ the best dental practices available, but in the 16th century, the best was often the worst. Henry's version of dental care involved a concoction made of powdered charcoal, burnt rosemary, crushed herbs, and sugar. Yes, sugar. He believed this sweet paste would clean and polish his teeth, brighten his smile, and mask the aftertaste of garlic, onion, and game. But it didn't clean. It corroded. The charcoal scraped away his enamel. The sugar fed the bacteria. And the result was a royal mouth slowly rotting from within. By the 1540s, ambassadors from foreign courts began noting the transformation. The once vibrant monarch was now thick-set, red-faced, and reluctant to speak too closely. His breath was described as foul, his teeth blackened, broken, and missing. He complained frequently of jaw pain and headaches. In his final years, some sources say he mumbled through speeches, his words slurred by abscesses and the growing gaps in his mouth. But there were no dentists, no anesthesia, no extractions without screams, and Henry, terrified of weakness, refused the agony. His rotting teeth stayed in his head, each one a festering reminder of indulgence gone too far. No one confronted him. How could they? To offend the king's pride was to risk your head. So when the stench of Henry's breath filled the room, courtiers simply leaned back. When he spoke, they nodded with downcast eyes. When he smiled, they smiled back, though perhaps more with their eyes than their mouths. The court, like the kingdom, adjusted itself around his decline. Servants brought clove-stuffed oranges for the king to sniff between meals. Rooms were perfumed with myrrh and camphor, but nothing could truly mask what was happening. The throne was rotting, starting at the teeth. In perhaps the strangest twist of all, the monarch's dental ruin sparked a courtly trend. Noblewomen, ever eager to flatter the king, began darkening their own teeth with soot or powdered cloves. What was once a mark of decay became a symbol of wealth and loyalty. After all, only those rich enough to eat as richly as the king could afford to mimic the results. The sight of blackened teeth in the royal court became so normalized that it took decades to fade as a fashion. Even in rot, Henry ruled, his decay wasn't hidden, it was embraced, because in Tudor England, if the king's smile was dark, then so too must yours be, and if you think skipping baths was shocking, what he did to keep his teeth clean might just make you gag. Stick around, this gets worse. And if you're enjoying the filthy secrets of royalty, don't forget to subscribe. There's more dirt where this came from. The chamber pot and the groom of the stool. In most homes, a chamber pot is a crude necessity, but in Henry VIII's world, even defecation was drenched in ceremony. His close stool wasn't just a toilet, it was a seat of royal authority, lined with velvet and embroidered cushions, framed in carved oak and covered with perfumed cloths. Beneath it, a ceramic basin collected the royal waste. But more than just an object, the stool symbolized access. It sat in the king's private chambers, near his bed, and accompanied him on long journeys, packed like a treasured artifact. Even nature's call had to be answered with decorum. The king would never squat like a common man. He would sit, and he would be assisted. The man who managed this ritual was no servant. He was the groom of the stool, a title that carried both mockery and reverence. His job was deeply personal, to oversee the king's toilet needs, to ensure his linen was fresh, his stool clean, and his dignity intact. But with that closeness came access to the king's most unguarded moments, and in the Tudor court, access meant influence. The groom helped dress the king, undress him, and listen to his private reflections. He handled the most delicate of duties with white-gloved hands, then whispered in the ears of ministers. He was not mocked. He was feared. Each day, the groom stood by as Henry relieved himself, ready to offer cloth, rosewater, and scented towels. No detail was too small. He observed the consistency of the king's waist, monitored for signs of blood or pain, and occasionally recorded the findings in medical logs. It was intimate surveillance, done with the elegance of a nobleman and the precision of a court physician. The groom was sworn to secrecy. What passed beneath the king's robes remained confidential, sealed behind a velvet curtain. But everyone at court knew. If you wanted to influence the king, you went through the man who saw him most vulnerable. Tudor medicine held that the bowels were windows to the soul and the throne. Physicians demanded reports on Henry's bowel movements. Were they regular, watery, foul-smelling? The groom recorded these details in discreet ledgers, written with the same careful pen as royal budgets. If the king was constipated, so too was the kingdom. If he suffered from diarrhea, the court adjusted accordingly. Doses of fig syrup, warm ale, or laxative pills were administered as needed, but no one gave them directly, except the groom. He wasn't just wiping a man. He was maintaining the monarchy's internal balance, quite literally. To outsiders, the role may sound humiliating, but in Henry's court it was prestigious. The groom of the stool had unparalleled proximity. He was often promoted to other influential roles: treasurer, advisor, diplomat. His loyalty was unquestioned, his discretion absolute. He had the king's trust because he had seen the king completely, stripped of armor, titles, and ceremony, and Henry, who trusted so few, guarded that bond fiercely. The groom didn't just manage filth, he curated privacy. He preserved the illusion, because no matter how powerful a monarch, no matter how golden the crown, every king must sit, must strain, must wipe. The difference? Henry had someone to make it look majestic. 5. Wigs, lice, and layers of stink. In his youth, Henry VIII was a vision of Renaissance virility. Thick auburn hair, broad shoulders, and a face that charmed nobles and commoners alike. But by middle age, illness, stress, and likely syphilis had begun to steal that youthful glow. His hair thinned, his crown revealed patches of bare scalp, and in a court where power was appearance, Henry couldn't be seen unraveling. So he turned to wigs, elaborate, curled, and heavy. These weren't just fashion statements, they were armor. Each wig was carefully crafted and styled to echo the king's former glory, powdered to perfection and pinned in place like a mask. But while they dazzled from afar, beneath them something festered. The pomades used to style Henry's wigs weren't fragrant creams. They were mixtures of beef tallow, bear grease, and lard, thick animal fat slathered over the scalp to hold curls in place. Combined with sweat, dust, and the heat beneath a velvet cap, it created the perfect breeding ground for lice, mites, and infection. Servants occasionally powdered his head with crushed lavender or clove to mask the smell, but it was never enough. The king's scalp was often raw and itchy, scarred from scratching, but he would never be seen bareheaded. Vanity, like power, demanded concealment, even if it crawled. Despite efforts to maintain the illusion, those near the king could smell the truth. His wigs absorbed the odor of old oils, his clothes held the rank scent of his leg wound, and his body, barely ever bathed, sweated beneath pounds of robes. The king wore musk, ambergris, and cinnamon-based perfumes. But these weren't just indulgences. They were defenses. The stench of decay followed him like a shadow. When he entered a room, his scent often arrived first. Diplomats sometimes requested outdoor audiences or opened windows discreetly behind tapestries, but no one dared speak of it aloud. Henry's smell became part of the room, just another reminder that even kings rot. Henry's wardrobe was vast. Fur-lined cloaks, jewel-encrusted sleeves, layers upon layers of silk and brocade, but many of these garments were rarely cleaned. Laundering them required dozens of servants, gallons of water, and precious hours, and even then fabrics like velvet and fur couldn't withstand frequent washing. So the robes were brushed, scented, and reworn. Inside, they trapped the sweat from state meetings, the odor of his wound dressings, and the mildew from long hours seated on a throne. His body ran hot from infections and weight gain, and his clothing only intensified it. Beneath the splendor, the king often steamed like a feverish animal wrapped in gold. For Henry VIII, cleanliness was not about purity, it was about protection. His wigs, perfumes, and robes weren't tools of hygiene. They were weapons against perception. To appear clean was to appear composed. To smell powerful was to be powerful. Beneath the wigs his scalp may have bled. Beneath the perfume his leg may have festered. But no one saw that. They saw a king draped in velvet, speaking with authority, eyes glinting with rage and glory. Henry didn't clean. He masked. He didn't wash. He conquered. With silk, with scent, with layers thick enough to bury the man underneath. Because in his world, even filth could be royal if you wore it well enough.